Welcome everybody. My name is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors. Thank you for joining us for the Accelerated Digital Transformation video series. This series would not be made possible without the generous support of our partners, Securely, Facilitron, AWS, and PowerSchool. 4 amazing companies with next-level resources you should consider adding to your district right away. So please click on their links, check out their sites, and let's get started. All right, welcome everybody. Tim Watrous here with Digital Advisors, and really happy to have Governor Bob Wise back and joining us for a federal update. There's a lot of news coming out of Washington. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of the most important things for school districts to hear, but we have a couple really important topics to jump in on. And just for the folks that don't necessarily know, Governor Wise, former governor and U.S. Congressman, also helped found a very powerful organization that helps schools called Future Ready. So Governor Wise, glad you're here. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be back, particularly at a very fast developing time.
Yeah, and glad you're here. So we did a little prep before this, and we were kind of talking about some of the biggest news stories that are out there. And I think the one that we figured we'd start focusing on first is the potential for a new chunk of stimulus that is very substantial for school districts. And could you just tell us a little about what you're hearing back in DC about that stimulus?
So a lot of discussion about education finally getting a federal stimulus package that represents what it needs. If you recall, there was $13.5 billion appropriated in a stimulus package about a month ago. That is far less than what was the stimulus package just a decade ago in 2009. And so another stimulus package is already passed. And so now the discussion is there a third one coming? And if so, will it have money for education? Predictions are that probably there will be another stimulus package. There certainly has been agreement on the need for a stimulus package that supports, it would be called a state and local stabilization fund. So this would be an allocation of money that would be divided up to support state and local governments. And then the question becomes, Tim, what about education? And there's a number of the large organizations in education, the School Board Association, National Association of State Boards of Education, and so on, are supporting a $200 billion stimulus package solely for education. And that will probably be what's on the table. Will it pass is something else, but this is important because right now we have 14,000 districts in this country that are having to do their budgets today or do their budgets in the immediate future. Most of them are making dire predictions about what their revenues are going to look like because of the COVID-19 crisis and the economy going in the tank. And so therefore, how much can they look to from the federal government? And that's why it's essential that the Congress act soon. Best predictions are that the Congress, and particularly the House of Representatives, will be back in early June. They're having discussions now, of course, but the earliest action you would see would be early June. And even then, it's not certain whether it would be done by July. So summary is nothing's done yet. Possibly discussions with major organizations of a $200 billion package. Not sure. And most important for schools and districts is that should be on top of whatever goes to state and local governments, not a part of. If it becomes a part of what goes to state and local governments, then the school district is going to be competing with the healthcare needs, the early responders, all the other problems that state and local governments are facing right now.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, let's keep our fingers crossed that we see those dollars actually materialize. The thing that jumps out at me is certainly the time frame. And if you're on a July 1 budget cycle and you get news in June, that might not be as early as you need to do effective planning. What's some of your guidance for a leader who sees this on the horizon and then that tight time frame with that July 1 budget year? How would you approach that?
I've unfortunately spent a career trying to match up the federal budget with what state and local needs are. And so what you have to do is you have to present what I call the AA budgets. The first is your adversity budget, assuming that you don't get many more dollars, if any, than what you got in the previous stimulus package. What budget do you present to your board and then do you seek approval of? That's your adversity budget. Now you develop your aspirational budget. That is, let's assume that there's going to be additional funds coming. And if there are, what will I do with those? And so you have those two ready to go. And of course, in the aspirational budget, you're also making more plans about what the future of your school district's going to look like. You understand that all districts are going to change significantly, schools are going to change. And so what is it that you're going to continue that's working well? What is it that you're not going to? And then how are you going to implement your vision of what education is going to be going forward post-COVID?
I like that. I like having, sort of the must budget, and then, like you said, the aspirational budget. I think that's a great lesson and some wisdom that folks can use if they're trying to navigate this time.
There's another benefit to that, because when you put out that adversity budget, now you're telling all your members of Congress, those that represent you in your area, here's what education is going to look like where you live. And so the important thing is they see how dire this can become. I think that further motivates people to do what needs to be done in terms of making sure there's a workable stimulus package.
And I think one of the things we touched on last time was just encouraging people to reach out to their local, congressmen and politicians, and basically say, we really need the support to give them the fuel they need to get as much as folks can in that June timeframe when people come back. Because as you said, the conversations are happening now, and if you squeak the wheel enough, we might be able to see a greater impact for education come June.
And you're going to have to do more than squeak this wheel. You're going to have to make it really sing, because this is a message that elected representatives, particularly our members of Congress, need to hear now, understanding once again all the budgeting that's taking place in every district office.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I guess thank you for sharing that. A couple of other things that we discussed were the FCC and some of the support that's coming out for schools in this, from the federal level. So talk to me a little bit about what you're hearing about the $2 billion potentially from the FCC.
In the last stimulus, or the major stimulus bill that passed about a month ago, there was a proposal on the House of Representatives for $2 billion to increase broadband access to low-income families. It's called the Lifeline. It would be paid for out of the Universal Service Fund, the same one that pays for the E-rate, and it would go to close what one FCC commissioner calls the homework gap. We have good broadband coverage now in most of our schools, but it's something else when the student goes home. So closing that homework gap. So the $2 billion was not adopted in the last stimulus package. And so it's being put forward again by a number of organizations. And indeed, some have even increased the price tag to $4 billion. And the recognition is distance learning is no longer something that a small percentage of our students are going to be involved in. In some way, distance learning is going to be with us permanently in some aspect. It won't be totally distance learning for all students, but there'll be a strong blended learning element, and also the need for students to be able to access the best resource materials when they're at home. So this would increase that. Certainly anyone who is talking about an infrastructure initiative, roads and bridges and buildings are incredibly important, but broadband access and being able to get to the information that you need is going to be the most critical. As I heard one international expert say the other day, it's no longer what you know, but what you're able to do with what you know. It's a Google generation. And so therefore, the importance of broadband access after that student leaves school. So in addition to the money that has been talked about for education and additional stimulus package, should there be, and I believe there should, an additional funding for increasing broadband access for low-income families at school, also obviously for rural areas. Yes, there's an existing initiative from the Federal Communications Commission, $9 billion, I believe, to support different types of carriers to put this kind of infrastructure in. And that's not to rule that out, but I also think that we know that there's value, and we've seen positive results from when the Federal Communications Commission, through the E-rate, through Lifeline, is able to get that money directly to the regions that need it the most.
Yeah, I think one thing that I really like about what you said for this potentially $2 and potentially $4 billion injection that school districts need is that it's talking about low income families who are struggling to get internet and not necessarily focused simply on rural. Both are important, but there are plenty of kids in inner cities and all over the country that are not necessarily rural that struggle getting internet access. And I like really thinking about both fronts. How do we get coverage where it isn't right now, and then how do we get how do we get services to folks who can't provide that connectivity we need to educate our children. So I think both are powerful. I guess to me, to hear that there's $2 billion on the table, potentially $4 billion, again, this brings us back to encouraging people to use their voice and use their collective voice. Are there any strategies you can think of that you would just encourage people to do right now? If you're a small, medium, or large district, how would you gather together and make as much noise, sing as you brought it up as possible, so we can see the biggest impact out of a stimulus package and potentially this FCC dollars that are on the horizon?
I think one way to have impact is holding meetings with your representatives or their staffs in the districts. These meetings will be distance learning meetings, and to the extent that some of them aren't able to take place because it's not good connectivity, that's a statement in itself. But also, I would urge that district leaders, teachers, educators contact their representatives to explain how the world changed 3 months ago. That before, when distance learning was not an essential element of education, we could get by and we could put together different ways to approach learning and getting students the information they need when they go home. That's not the case anymore. Distance learning is something that is ubiquitous. It has suddenly gone from a small percentage of students to 100% of students. And even when schools resume in some form, the ability to access information and learn at home is going to be even more essential than it ever was before. And so making that case why the world has changed in education in just 3 months in each person's congressional district, I think is essential.
Well, I think those are great. That's some great feedback to end on, and I want to thank you so much for joining us again for this federal update. Any closing thoughts for folks, just at a very high level of the things that we've discussed? I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you had anything you wanted to wrap up with, I just want to give you the opportunity.
The main thing is, I think the old cliche about the last train out of the station. I think if there's going to be a stimulus package, there's one more train leaving. And it's the one that's going to be leaving in June or July. And the important thing is to make sure that education occupies a large part of that train, because I don't think it gets better for education than this. It's going to get harder and harder to achieve stimulus funding the farther away we get, particularly once school resumes and dire budgets that were made 2 or 3 months ago now have to be put into effect. So I would urge action now.
Well, thank you very much for taking this time to share your wisdom, Governor Wise. It's been a pleasure as always, and we'll look forward to doing one of these again shortly. Keep us posted on what's happening in DC, and stay well, and we'll be talking to you again soon.
Good talking with you.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and please keep in mind that our vision and mission is to support K-12 leaders with the expertise they need to make critical decisions in the short and long term around technology and innovation. So if you have some questions specifically about working with us or questions about the content you saw in the video, please direct them to info@daexpertise.com. We'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.